The 2008 global financial crisis has called into question the American capitalist model. The current crisis could similarly spur major Asian economies, make governments more transparent, efficient, and accountable. The question, however, is whether Asian countries will pursue economic reforms as they did after 1997, or undermine the benefits of trade by embracing anti-competitive and populist ideas.
Great. Well, thank you all very much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Joseph Sternberg, and I'm an editorial page writer with the Wall Street Journal based in Hong Kong. And on behalf of our panelists and myself, I'd like to thank our hosts at the Asan Institute for calling us together today for certainly a discussion of a topic that's very near and dear to me and my colleagues on the journal's editorial page. This issue of how developments in the economies outside of Asia are bearing on the political economy in Asia. And so I think that certainly we're due for a very interesting discussion on that this afternoon, and trying to understand how people in the region here have interpreted events overseas and what lessons they're drawing, and what some of the potential implications for economic policy in Asia might be from those. And so to discuss that topic with us this afternoon, we have first immediately to my left Dr. Jongryn, who's a research fellow at the Asan Institute and also the Vice President for International Affairs at Yonsei University. And to his left, we have Dr. Jennifer an assistant professor in the Graduate School of International Studies at Ewha Women's University. And to her left, we have Ms. Natalia Soebagjo, who's the Executive Director of the University of Indonesia's Center for the Study of Governance. And to her left, last but not least, we have Dr. Xuedong, who's the Deputy Director of the Center for Global Governance and Development in Beijing. And so I think what we'd like to do, perhaps, is give our panelists a brief opportunity to offer some initial thoughts on this issue, and then we'll try to have an opportunity to discuss amongst ourselves up here on the platform, and then open it up to some questions both for you in the audience and people who might be watching us over the internet. So without further ado, actually, Jongryn has asked me to start at the far end, so if it's not going to surprise the folks down there, perhaps we could start with Dr. Yang for some of his initial thoughts, and then work our way in this direction.
So my first?
Yes.
So I just follow this agenda. Okay. Thank you very much. Actually, I also thank you this plenum, because it was it's a first trip for me to visit your country. Even I know a lot of film made by your country. I know your soccer team very powerful, but actually I didn't visit your country. For me, actually, I think I'm not very qualified to talk about this topic, because we say we are not capitalist, we are socialist with Chinese characteristics. But anyway, for any country, if you want to develop, you have to rely upon capital, rely upon capitalist, rely upon entrepreneur. So if you lack of these factors, you cannot development. For China, I think if you look at China, why China grows so rapidly, because in the past 30 years, we have this factor. We mobilize this factor. So now we have a very big firms. We also have a very active entrepreneur. So as for the global crisis impact upon China, I should talk about three factors: the state, the capital, and the society. We can see, actually, these three factors try to adjust themselves to deal with the crisis. As for the state, so we can see on the national level and the local level, the national level, after the national level, try to inform its administration system to make it more efficient, and try to reform its revenue system, taxation system, and the loading system to help enterprises to adjust to this crisis. But if you look at the local level, you can find different reactions. On the coastline region, the local government make efforts to change its industrial structure. So then it force some capital go inland, move to the inland. But for the local states in inland, they also make a lot of effort to attract this capital. Because China, we have many local governments, they can keep with each other to attract this capital. So the government become more efficient. If you look at this, the capital, I think now two phenomena are more evident. One phenomenon is some capital, they become very international. They flow out of China. So if you know China, if you read Chinese newspaper, they talk about a new phenomenon. We call it outflow of a rich person. They fled to the West. They bring a lot of capital with them. So that's one phenomenon. Another phenomenon, some capital, especially some capital, mainly in the industry, they try to make some technical innovation. We call it upgrading industry. Then some capital, they shifted from the industry to some very new technologies such as networking. So it's grow very quickly. Now in China, we also have many we call venture capital. They go to some metropolitans such as Beijing, Shanghai to find some potential entrepreneur from university. So that's the second phenomenon as for capital. But besides the state and the capital's reaction, we also have to notice this society is changing very quickly. I think for China, if talk with ordinary people, they have the same answer. They agree with the economic development. It's very important for China. But after 30 years reform, there are now some new social problems, such as labor issues, such as environmental issues, such as social inequality. So now the society not only pay attention to economic growth, they also hope this social problem can be solved very quickly. So now they are, in some sense, in some regions, they're not very welcoming capital. They have their own option, their own selection. They are against the capital. So now in China, we can say the environmental protest is rising very quickly. Even every year, probably it's now the main factor for social unrest, the environmental protection. So on the other hand, because in China many capital they are original capital, they are local capital. So they still have a very close relationship with local society. Probably we call it's a culture. So because they have a very good relationship with local society, so this capital can get more support from the local society, from local government, especially during the global crisis. You can see actually some capital, they return to their hometown. For example, in Fujian, it's a province in the coastline. Some capital, they left from Shanghai, they go back to their hometown to establish the new production base. That's a very worthy noticing phenomena. So then my conclusion. So for China, I think in the future, China have to balance the relationship between among state, the capital, and the society. Probably the state have to pay more attention to the request from the society, not only this request from this capital. So then it's better for its stable, sustainable growth. So that's my point. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And Natalia, perhaps if we can come to you next.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? You cannot hear me. Oh, okay, all right. Thank you very much. Well, this is a very big topic, and I'm going to just limit myself to the Indonesian perspective. For those of you who have been following the progress of Indonesia, you must well know that Indonesia has gone through several crises in its history. And so the 97-98 crisis, which was so life-changing for us, was not really the first crisis that we have had. We have had crises in the 60s. We had the crisis with the Pertamina oil case in the 70s. And then after the fall of the oil price in the 80s, we had another crisis. But then was different to now. We were able to deal with the crises then much easier, so to speak, because at that time, power was in the authority and power was in the hands of President Suharto. We were under an authoritarian system. There was no organized political opposition. There was parliament was a rubber stamp parliament. Business interests colluded with power, and so it was very much more manageable. But at that time, even though our institutions were weak, we were able to overcome the crises that we faced. But then again, after the success of the 80s, then came the 90s, and we call it the decaying 90s. And that was the time during which President Suharto transformed the way our economics was run from a developmental state to what has been described as a predatory state, in which power became even more concentrated within the Suharto family, not just the president. It was rent-seeking, there was abuse of power, there were a lot of dubious development projects, a lot of off-budget items. And so this, not surprisingly, then led to the 97-98 crisis, although we have to admit that it was the reaction to the Asian financial crisis on the whole. But the 1997-98 crisis was, we were the hardest hit of all the countries in the region. It took us almost 7 years to regain what we had achieved prior to the 97-98 crisis. And we were basically one of the last to graduate from the IMF supported stabilization program. But that crisis gave us the opportunity to to change, well, not to change, but to reform our country from an authoritarian country to a democratic country. So it has been a life-changing experience. And so when the 2008 crisis came, we were better prepared because of the reforms that had taken place. And we were also not that much connected to the US economic situation at that time, although we were impacted. But the fall of Suharto enabled us to do several things. We were able to undertake political reform. We basically started our democratization process after the fall of Suharto. We had electoral reform, we had decentralization and the devolution of power. We had economic reforms, we improved the financial and the banking system. Tax reforms, we dealt with cross-ownerships and the conglomerates in Indonesia. We improved tax reform, customs reform. And at the same time, we also experienced social reform in the sense that after the fall of Suharto, there arose a proliferation of civil society organizations. Civil society organizations were addressing issues that governments were unwilling to address. We constantly kept up the pressure. Of course, as freedom of the press, I think our press is probably the most free of all presses, although there are signs of backsliding because of the ownership of our major media outlets. Corruption eradication was also something that we were able to seriously address after the fall of Suharto. We are still attempting to undertake legal reform of the law enforcement agencies. We established the Corruption Eradication Commission, which is a model for many CECs in the region. We've set strategies, both midterm, long-term strategies on combating corruption. And also one of the priorities of the current government is to do administrative reform, bureaucracy reform, primarily so that the bureaucracy is more in keeping with the demands of the 21st century. It has to change its mindset from being one of power into one of a stress on service, on public service. It has to start thinking about greater transparency and accountability in the way it runs in government. And also the open government initiative that was earlier mentioned by Professor Krasser is something that we are ascribing to. So these are changes that would not have been possible 20 years ago during Suharto's period. But then again, 15 years after the fall of Suharto, we are still facing immense challenges. Although we are committed to fighting corruption, we haven't really improved. If we look at the Transparency International's CPI, our level has basically been stagnant. We are at the moment only faring better than the CLMV countries in Southeast Asia. Last year, we were better than the Philippines, but in 2011, we were better than the Philippines. At 2012, we've slipped behind the Philippines. If you look at our Human Development Index, we're still below average. We have a survey called the Public Sector Integrity Survey, which is done by our Corruption Eradication Commission. We've also made very, very minor improvements. In the Doing Business report, despite our efforts to improve doing business in Indonesia, we haven't made significant progress. And so the question is, are the reforms that we're undertaking, are they sustainable? It depends on whether you're taking the optimistic view. If you take the optimistic view, you would want to say that all this is part of the process of consolidating our democratic state, that if we continue to strengthen our institutions, if we continue to stress transparency, accountability, and participation, and then widen the scope of citizens' participation in the decision-making process, we will be able to see significant progress. That's the optimistic view. And if you believe that we are going towards the path of liberal democracies with free market system and so on. But the other side of the coin, or not the other side of the coin, if you look at the glass half empty, you will find that the democracy that we are facing is more towards an oligarchic democracy because of corruption that is so intense and so wide, the scope. We see now political interests, business interests interacting with the economic policy setting, with corruption involving political bureaucratic elites combined with the economic players. We see that the collaboration that was successful in Japan a few years ago, whereby business, government, and the bureaucracy were some sort of a troika, we're sort of corrupting that into a system which is basically eroding our future growth. Electoral politics, the democracy that we have, because we have elections practically every day, or if you count the local elections, it's become very expensive. It has created business elites who abuse their capital to further their political interests, to buy political positions in the legislature. So we are sort of very worried about the developments that we see in Indonesia, because we feel that we may be faring away from the ideals of a liberal democracy and a free market system into one that is even more predatory than during the Suharto period, in the sense that now power has been devolved into local elites, regional power, and which on the whole is very is weakening the state. So that, in a very, very quick nutshell, is sort of what is happening in Indonesia. And the most troubling is that our macroeconomic is doing very well, and so people don't see the underlying turbulence behind the impressive figures. The discourse in Indonesia at the moment is basically what will happen next, where are we going, where are we heading, because the political leadership at the moment, there is a leadership crisis, and in 2014 we will be facing elections, and at the moment it is unclear yet what kind of a leader will come out in the foray of the elections. So I think that should be enough of an introduction.
Thank you very much, and you've raised a couple points I think we should come back to once we do the panel discussion, but for now I'd like to turn it over to Jennifer for some of her thoughts.
Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Today I'll limit my discussion to post-2008 capitalism in Japan. So I want to organize my discussion around a very interesting observation. So unlike the previous recessions in the 90s and 2000s, the 2008 global financial crisis generated very strong political rhetoric for social policy, as opposed to market reform rhetoric in the previous recessions. But when you actually try to look at the actual impact of the 2008 crisis on Japanese capitalism, the impact is quite insignificant. And by structure of Japanese capitalism, I'm talking about institutional traits developed under the developmental state, such as state intervention in the economy, main bank system, lifetime employment, long-term supplier networks, and so on. And in fact, what we observe is very strong continuities in Japanese capitalism over multiple periods of recession and crisis. And there's little indication that this 2008 crisis will push Japan away from the developmental state model. And one argument I would like to bring up for discussion is I believe that the heavy emphasis on distributive politics in Japan is largely responsible for this resilience in Japanese capitalism. So when you look at the 2008, the post-crisis period, there are some marked differences. One is this huge shift in rhetoric. And when you think about the 1990s and 2000s, political leadership was talking about market reform. So examples of market reforms during this time, you have the Big Bang reform in the financial sector, the privatization of the postal savings system. But when you hit the 2009 lower house election, both major parties are actually endorsing welfare expansion. So you have the DPJ, a Democratic Party of Japan, their election platform is titled Putting People's Lives First. And their entire platform is on how to increase welfare spending on childcare, health services, pension, and so on, and very similar on the LDP platform as well. Both parties caution against excessive market fundamentalism. Neither party calls for fundamental structural reforms. So there is this clear shift in the post-2008 crisis. What's really ironic is despite this rhetoric shift, the primary government strategy to overcome the crisis is very similar to the previous decades. So you have the Democratic Party of Japan, they rely on really heavy government spending. This is a practice traditionally associated with the LDP, a practice that the DPJ themselves criticized during the election campaign. But what results is in 2009, the DPJ government, their fiscal budget reaches a historic high. So what we see is increasing pressure on the government budget. And what's also interesting is the pattern of spending is also very similar to previous decades. So there is not much of a difference when we look at the government spending and pattern of spending under the Democratic Party of Japan and the previous government. And so the one implication we can get is irrespective of whether the government pushes for market reform or welfare expansion, the strategy they use is large government spending. And the reason they have to do this is precisely because of the importance of distributive politics in Japan. And fiscal stimulus continues to play a very large role in the current Abe administration. I know that Abenomics is receiving a lot of attention these days. But if you look at the fiscal stimulus package that was revealed a couple months ago, the package size amounts to about 20.2 trillion yen. The bulk of the fiscal stimulus measures goes to support for small, medium-sized enterprises, agriculture, forestry, and fisheries, and infrastructure building. And this is precisely how the previous governments under the LDP and the Democratic Party of Japan spent their fiscal stimulus measures on construction and on inefficient and protected sectors like agriculture, forestry, and fisheries. And although Abe right now emphasizes that he wants to promote private investment growth, the actual budget, the amount of the fiscal stimulus that's allocated to that, it's very small. So one example is, if you look at the amount of money spent for Japanese overseas business expansion, that's 0.3 trillion yen. I mean, that's in comparison to about 8.5 trillion yen set aside for SMEs, agriculture, forestry, and fisheries. There's a very huge difference there. Another 0.3 trillion yen for human capital development employment, and about 3.2 trillion yen for stimulating private investment. So there is a disparity in the size of money that's allocated for private investment growth and to traditional sectors such as these protected sectors and construction. So how do you explain this? How do you explain the strong continuity in government spending behavior and pattern of spending, irrespective of change in ruling party, change in party political leadership, and also change in political rhetoric? And I think that we have to look at distributive politics in Japan to answer this. if you examine the Democratic Party of Japan's campaign strategy in 2009, you observe by 2009 the Democratic Party of Japan has come very close to the LDP in terms of ideology, values, and policies. There's not much differentiating the two parties. One example is that the Democratic Party of Japan's support for small government and their reluctance to increase consumption tax reduces over time. So this brings them closer to the LDP. And in the 2009 election, one of the main strategies of the Democratic Party of Japan is to outpromise the LDP in government spending to capture the traditional voters of the LDP. And this is seen in their policy towards agriculture. So what they do is the DPJ promised far more generous and expansive policies to support the farming sector to capture the traditional constituents that used to vote for the LDP. And this worked in 2009. The DPJ did capture majority of the rural and semi-rural single-member district seats in the 2009 lower house election. So I think one thing you have to think about is, unless Japanese political leaders are willing to undermine or go against the interests of these vested interests, whether it's in construction or agriculture or in declining sectors, it's very difficult for political leaders to implement structural reform. And without structural reform, it's very difficult to bring about fundamental changes in Japanese capitalism. And that's why studies in Japanese capitalism going from the early 1990s until present, many of them show that Japanese capitalism is very resilient. Despite very strong pressures to change, the market behavior of market actors, you see very limited change in corporate governance, in the employment system, in the main bank system. Although a lot of the larger corporations in Japan have shifted away from the main bank system, you still see this close connection between a dominant bank and companies in Japan. So I think I would like to close with some comments on the Abe administration. The Abenomics, although it's receiving a lot of attention, and I know that Abe is saying that his fiscal stimulus package is not pork barrel politics. There's very little evidence at this point that what he's doing is very different from what other political leaders in Japan have done. There's no significant change in the fiscal stimulus package, and the same sectors are receiving support from the government. And if these same sectors are vested interests that both major political parties in Japan are competing for votes, then I think it's very difficult for political leaders to spend the money differently. And so if you look at even Japan's approach to the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and Abe, in his attempt to try to get domestic support for the TPP, he has promised that he will protect Japan's agriculture and its food at all costs. And this is Abe's position, even though he is trying to actively bring Japan into the TPP and have this negotiation be accepted domestically. So, in conclusion, unless Abe is willing to challenge vested interests the way that his predecessor Koizumi did, I think structural reform is very difficult. And even Koizumi was not able to implement a very substantial or radical structural reform in Japan, despite his willingness to challenge all of these vested interests in Japan. So.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I think to wrap up sort of our opening salvo, we'll turn to Jongryn now for some thoughts, I think, on the situation in Korea.
Thank you. I will focus on the Korean case in my remark. And when the financial crisis began in 2008, we had a government at the time led by President Lee Myung-bak that was very committed to free market economics and committed to moving the Korean economy to the American style capitalism. 5 years later, this year, we have a new president. Her name is Park Geun-hye, and then in her inaugural speech, she said she wants to change Korean capitalism and declare the beginning of a new model of capitalism. And the three words, the key words in a speech were economic welfare, and economic security, and economic democratization, and building a creative economy. So these are the three key words she emphasized, and which is, you can say, a radical departure from President Lee's policy. He emphasized at the time national competitiveness, free trade, deregulation, and privatization, the classic market reforms. So if you compare President Lee and President Park, you'd think that they come from different parties, but in fact they are from the same party. So for political economists, I mean, this is a puzzle. What happened to the Korean Conservative Party? Their vision, economic vision, and their economic policy. I would argue in my remark that actually it's a little bit more complicated than that, and some people wonder whether a Korean Conservative Party changed at all, or for that matter, whether Korea has ever changed since the 1960s. So, but I will, despite that, I will argue that these changes are interesting in this, and I think these are real change, represent real changes, and because if you look at conservative politicians, you can't find anybody now who will support free market economics. So Park Geun-hye is like most other conservative politicians who abandoned, in a way, neoliberal economic reforms or market reforms, and proposing something that's very traditionally considered progressive or left-wing, especially economic democratization. So the rhetoric changed, and some policy changed, and second interesting question. So I'm saying that these changes are real, and you know, we should explain why this happened, and of course, if I have a chance, I will explain the politics of economic policy since 2008. But given that these are real changes, the question is whether these policy changes will change Korean politics. And what's interesting to us is whether it will change really what we call the Korean model of capitalism. My answer to the first question, whether it will change Korean politics, Park Geun-hye, after all, won the election. And if you talk to Park Geun-hye advisors, many of them will say, well, we haven't really changed, given up free market economics, but we just had to win the election. So, you know, I'm doing research now whether actually Park Geun-hye's shift to the left on the economic dimension actually won many votes for her. It's not clear because she wanted to win votes from young voters and middle-class voters. Whether she actually attract those votes is questionable. So that needs to be more investigated further. But even for her future administration, it'll be very important that she wins or some bills on her electoral coalition and add some more supporters, because her now approval ratings are around 45, getting close to 50%. But that's very unusual in Korean politics. And new presidents enjoy very high approval ratings. So it'll be interesting to see whether her new economic policy will change the ruling party coalition. And economically, though, I mean, there's you can make an argument that it's about time, because that we need to build a new social welfare system in Korea, and the old style of redistribution, spending money on education or rural development. These things have to change, and the Korea is now wealthy enough, and economic inequality is a serious enough problem that we need to change our economic orientation. That's true. But whether this kind of action will build a new coalition for economic growth, that I think was very interesting and for scholars like me. My second question, whether it will change the Korean model of capitalism, it all depends on what we mean by that. And traditionally, whenever we talk about Korean model, we talk about export-led growth, development. If we define the Korean model that way, that our commitment to export, our promotion, I don't think Park Geun-hye's policy will change that much. I mean, there are many reasons why I remain fairly skeptical whether Park Geun-hye's policy will change, because economic export promotion is the only thing we know, as far as how to promote economic growth. And it'll have new policies like support for small and medium-sized enterprises and new venture capitalists or venture industries or high-tech industry. It'll take a long time. But the world economy is in such a condition that I don't think the Korean public will wait for whole new policy to produce result. And it's this kind of a pressure on Park Geun-hye is already happening. It's been only 2 months since the inauguration, but our economic growth is very slow. And Japan is doing so much better than us. And now people are saying, what are we doing? We need to, make another push and support our big companies and increase our exports. So it won't be too long that she will change her policy. That's my prediction, but I don't know if I want to make many predictions. But so if we think of the Korean model as the one based on export-led growth, I don't think Korea will change. And what this means is that the implications of this retrenching of the export-led model is, of course, is predictable. They will have a more active and pragmatic state, supporting new government agendas like jobs, welfare, and industrial policy in favor of small and medium-sized companies, and much closer business-government relations. At the moment, they are not on good terms with each other, but I think they will come around and they will start working together to support government agendas. And I think, and this for a while, that we have to find a way. I think the government will try to keep our currency very undervalued to make our exports competitive with the Japanese. So this is my remark.
Well, thank you. I am going to be keeping my eye on the watch so that we have some time for audience Q&A at the end. But before we get to that, I just will take the opportunity to ask a couple questions to our panelists myself. Really, my question boils down to the second of the three guiding questions that we had for this panel, which is how has the 2008 financial crisis affected the political discourse on capitalism and the market economy in East Asia? And I'd actually like to sort of zero in on maybe two components of that can each one can get directed to two different panelists. And so I'd like to start with our experts on China and Japan, just by asking about what the understanding in East Asia is of what happened in the West in 2008. It seems that if you want to talk about how a financial crisis in America or Europe is going to play out politically here, a big question has to be, what does the public understand about what the problems were? I mean, this has certainly been a battle we've been fighting, my colleagues and I at the Journal, trying to argue this wasn't necessarily a failure of capitalism, it was a failure of specific government policies. But I'm always curious about how that message filters down, and what people in China or Japan, for example, think about what caused the crisis. How do those thoughts affect their own economic policy views? So perhaps, Xuedong, if we can turn to you first, I mean, for more of a sense of what is the common understanding in China right now about what contributed to the crisis in the U.S. and what China should do to avoid following a similar path.
Yeah. Okay. I think if you ask ordinary people in China, probably don't know what's the global crisis. But if you ask the officials, especially local officials, they will say, yes, we are now facing a very big crisis because their revenue reducing very rapidly, especially in 2008 and 2009. Because in the coast area, the local government's revenue mainly from the export. So because the factory cannot work, so there's no export, so they have no income, then the revenue reducing. Of course, some country also fled to inland, also from the Southeast Asia, for example, Vietnam and Cambodia. So for them, they feel it very strongly. So how to deal with this crisis? I think if you look at the national policy, probably two main measures. One is how to create domestic demand. Because in China, probably in South Korea, Japan, people have a strong tendency to save money. They don't want to expand. In China, it's very serious. So because in China, because we have no very complex social system, especially the social security system, so the people have to rely upon themselves for their life. So then the national government now invests a lot to establish the social security system to try to encourage people to consume. But for me, I think it's a long way. So because you have to change the people's tradition mindset. So another, I think the main measure is the national government and some local government try to to quicken the industrial upgrading. Because now for China, we still rely upon the labor-intensive industry. So they want to make this industry more capital-intensive or technology-intensive. But for me, it's also very hard to change this industrial structure very quickly. Because on the one hand, if you want to change it, but you have to solve the unemployment. So we have a very huge labor force. So if there's no this labor-intensive industry, how people to find their job? It's also it's probably the big issue for the government. Anyway, if just look at the people's life, the ordinary people's life, I don't think the global crisis influence people's life very seriously. Probably it's different from from that in the United States, because in China most people they have their own saving, so they didn't didn't loan to make life. They just rely upon their saving to make life. So that's totally different, probably.
Mm-hmm. Jennifer, I wonder if you can comment a little bit on the sort of the public opinion on the crisis in Japan, and particularly, how does the public there understand what happened in the West, and are there thoughts or sort of what interplay does that have on the political process when you then go to talk about moving along with reform or other policy issues?
First, I think it's a little difficult to measure what the people think about the crisis in the West. I mean, political discourse-wise, but I think one good way to address this question is to look at the people's expectation from the government, so which is filtering in their interpretation of the 2008 crisis. And as I said in my opening statement, I think this clear shift in post-2008 is that the 2008 crisis that occurred globally was a reminder that the state needs to continue to protect the people and continue and perhaps not push forward a lot of the neoliberal policies that they were aiming to do in the 1990s and 2000s. So if the previous recession there was some general support, some idea, sense that the way that Japan had developed the institutions, the Japanese capitalism, led to the burst of the bubble economy and the long recession. Post-2008, there is this acceptance from the people that there has to be a greater government role in protecting their daily lives and security and social security. And I think this is well reflected in the positions of both political parties in the past few elections, lower house and upper house. One thing I do want to say is we have to think about Japan in the broader context of prolonged recession, the long experience with recession. So even if the rhetoric was market reform in the 90s and 2000s, that doesn't mean that the people were willing to undergo very drastic market reform. So even then, the expectation was business actors, bureaucrats, consumers, workers, all of them still expect that the government would cushion them from the impact of the reform. And that's why reform was so gradual, was so incremental, and to critics of the Japanese capitalism, they would say was so limited precisely because of that. So there isn't that much of a change because actually the norm, what the people expect are pretty similar in that even if you have a market reform, we should be cushioned from the impact. Now that there's a 2008 crisis, this is a reminder that the government needs to continue to play a role to secure livelihood and standard of living.
And I'd like to phrase that question slightly differently for Natalia and Jongryn, just because Indonesia and Korea, as we discussed in your comments, are two countries that underwent a very wrenching reform process after the 97 crisis in order to try to more closely align institutions in those countries with a Washington consensus style norm. And now that Washington itself is experiencing various crises, even as Indonesia and Korea have work to do. I mean, I'm keen, Natalia in particular, to have a view from Indonesia about whether events in the economy that was really supposed to be a model for East Asia after 97, how is that changing the politics of some of these ongoing reforms you were describing?
Well, we were not so badly hit by the 2008 crisis, and that was primarily because our economy was driven by consumption, domestic consumption, and the price of commodities, and so we didn't feel the impact as greatly because since the crisis we've been growing at roughly 6% a year, which is much higher than the average elsewhere. But there is recently talk about suspicions or worry about Indonesia becoming more inward-looking, more nationalistic, but that sense is, I think, pandering to the elections that's coming up, but it's also created by the sense of new confidence that we have because our economy is doing so well. We're taking a greater part in global leadership. We were part of the Open Government Initiative, we're part of the G20, and so we've got this new sense of confidence. The role of the state, Washington consensus versus Beijing consensus and the like, it is not so much in in the public discourse, primarily because we now see the state being so weak. And hence bureaucracy reform, administrative reform, which is meant to strengthen the efficiency of the state, has become a priority. But this cannot be done without strong political will and leadership in trying to change the mode of thinking of an outdated bureaucracy. So even if we were to depend more on the state to play a bigger role, at this point in time, the central government, at least, is in no position to do so. So I mean, the talk in the public discourse is that our country is being run on autopilot, sort of captainless and rudderless and buoyed by the strong domestic economy.
Jongryn, just a few minutes if you can expand on that issue from the Korean perspective, and then we'll try to open up to some audience Q&A. So I guess the question is, has this perception that capitalism in America experienced a major meltdown in 2008, is that really showing up, for example, in newspaper columns or in political speeches or other ways that are influencing the kind of political shift you were discussing in your opening comments?
Yes. Again, it's a bit more complicated. Wall Street lost status as a model. I think Silicon Valley is still remains as a very strong model for Korea. So when President Park talks about the creative economy, exactly that's the kind of high-tech entrepreneurial economy that she wants to create in Korea, and the Silicon Valley is been being mentioned as her model. So and then the United States is coming back strong this year. So maybe I think the U.S. model will become attractive again to Koreans. So about your questions about in between 2008 and 2012, and we lost at the time our model, and it wasn't just us Koreans, but everybody discredit the neoliberal model or the American style capitalism. And what's interesting is that we took the failure of financial capitalism or American capitalism to be a failure of Korean capitalism during that time, during 2008 and 2012. And if you look at the dynamics of the political discourse at the time, actually the Michael Sanders book, Justice, became a huge bestseller in Korea, and that changed the tone of discourse. Now, not only the opposition party the opposition party have been traditionally a liberal and supported bigger government, but also the conservative party and the conservative politicians just jumped on the bandwagon now. Now capitalism is. We already knew that capitalism was unstable, but now capitalism is inherently unjust, and you get the impression that some now politicians think that even growth is not good for you. So people don't talk about growth anymore. So we see from the abrupt change from support for American-style free market economics to a progressive European model, a welfare state model, a support for a welfare state model, and we can, of course, do research on these questions. But fundamentally, it's not a big surprise if you think about this, because Korean we never really had a strong liberal base. That individualism and liberalism are never been very strong in Korea, and then people like Amson would say that that the American trained economists like people like me are the ones who support these liberal ideas, but the businessmen and the society people as a whole do not have strong commitment to liberal values. And so this abrupt change in political discourse, I think, is a reflection of a weak liberal tradition in Korean culture. And other than that, at the moment, I don't really have a good answer as to why this happened, and remains a puzzle to me. And there are people like me who continue to support the old American-style capitalism, but a big minority in Korea. Yeah.
We can open it up to some audience questions now, and if I can just ask you to identify yourself at the beginning and then keep it brief. And so I think that was the first hand I saw back there, and we have some microphones going around.
Thank you very much. My name is To Kin Woon from the Penang Institute, Penang, Malaysia. I'm not sure what I'm going to say and ask is a repetition of what has already been discussed. I am concerned over one trend. After all the crisis, or even before that, there seems to be a convergence in accepting and implementing neoliberal policies, which essentially argue that the state, especially when states want to reform, must shrink the size of the public sector, spend less, especially on social services, privatize, sell all your sell most of your state assets, reduce taxes for the rich, but in place introduce and increase rates of taxes for the poor. Now, the end result, and I think this is quite universal, I think, is a very unequal distribution of income and wealth. My question is whether this increasing trend towards a very unequal distribution of income and wealth features in public discourses, whether amongst policymakers or academics, or whether it's totally ignored. I mean, accepting it as a matter of course, or accepting it as a price to pay for so-called greater growth. Thank you.
Maybe we can actually start on that question in Japan, since we were discussing earlier a broader discussion about social spending there. I mean, is inequality on the agenda?
Yeah, so I would have to say that I'm not sure if Japan follows that trend that was just mentioned. I think the 1990, under Prime Minister Koizumi in the 2000 was the time when Japan had that opportunity to have drastic market reform following neoliberal policies. But a lot of studies that assess the actual impact of it show that the change is not that much, especially if you're looking at Social Security payments. Governments, the percentage of payment to Social Security, I think, is consistently very substantial in public expenditure in Japan. It's only growing over time, so we don't see a decrease. Right now, what I would worry about Japan is that major political parties are competing to give more to gain votes. So what we have is more types of subsidies and supports and various kind of income support that are being given out to groups of people in society. They're targeting more groups, whether it's parents, or the elderly, or workers, or whether it's some kind of pension support. There seems to be a push right now that both political parties are doing to give more, trying to promise more. So I'm not sure if this trend of implementing neoliberal policy applies to Japan. And even if they said they do, I think many Japanese observers would agree that they actually don't carry out with what they say, especially in these neoliberal direction.
Natalia, I'd also like to maybe go to you for some thoughts on that, because I know that various reforms, especially concerning fuel subsidies, and are often in the news. I mean, how?
I think, this issue of fuel subsidies and the subsidies for the poor is constantly being discussed. The government and all academics basically are united in the belief that these fuel subsidies have to be remanaged. At the moment, when fuel is very cheap, we're not talking about an increase of the fuel price to about 67 cents, which is very low. And we're spending about $20 billion alone for fuel subsidies, which is about 15% of the budget. And so we know that this issue has to be tackled. But the problem is the public, of course, would not want to see these subsidies removed. But they are in agreement of having it retargeted because they now understand that we, the middle classes, are the ones who are enjoying these subsidies. But unfortunately, the government, the leadership, is very hesitant in pulling these subsidies, especially during election year. I mean, only in the papers this morning, now they're talking about a single price. Previously, last week, we were still talking about having two different prices, but then the logistics of trying to implement this is just too difficult to manage. And so there's constant debate, and so much so that the belief is that when push comes to shove, this current government will not make that difficult decision and just remain policies as they are until elections pass. So we in Indonesia, perhaps like in Malaysia, we also have this debate about how liberal should our economy be and how do we protect ourselves from the consequences of a liberal free market economy, and that we are still continuously grappling with. But it's how to soften the impact of the system that we have no choice but to adopt.
Time is running short. I did see one more hand. I thought if we have any other audience questions, we'll get you a mic.
Okay, my name is Stefan Gaszewski. I'm from Hamburg University of Foreign Studies. And first of all, thank you very much for this excellent plenum. I think it was really good to hear your insights. My question is for the Chinese speaker, Dr. Yang. I was wondering about the situation in China. You often hear about the increasing gap between the rich from the coastal cities and the more poor mainland China. How would you evaluate the changes and the rising gap between the rich from the poor and the poor? And also, I think you mentioned about that the mainland China also wants to attract more capital. What is your opinion on that? How would you see that for the future?
Actually, it's now become a very big problem for China. The gap become bigger and bigger because according to the Gini coefficient, it's now almost probably over 0.5. It's beyond the dangerous line according to international standard. But for me, if China want to make its economy growth more sustainable, it have to deal with it. But it's also very tough job for the authority because now the local authorities, they have they are more strong willing to resist the central policy. Probably in the future we have to reform the taxation system and the revenue system. So otherwise you cannot balance the interest between central and localities.
I know it's going to give our organizers heartburn, but if we can just take one more question, even though we're right up against the end. Nick, did you have your hand up?
Thank you, Joe. Nick Eberstadt from American Enterprise Institute. We can talk about the housing crisis as part of this crisis of capitalism, the housing bubble in the United States. We can talk about the banking crisis, but we also see as part of this ongoing phenomenon a sort of a financial crisis of the welfare state in all of the affluent countries. And much of what we see in Europe nowadays has to do with this crisis of the overdeveloped welfare state. Jennifer mentioned that one of the public reactions in Japan to the crisis was to want government to mitigate risk and to step in to protect people. And we see that in other emerging parts of Asia with programs to grow the welfare state. How much has the discussion of the OECD welfare state problems informed the thinking about the new welfare states that are growing in Southeast Asia and elsewhere in Asia?
Jongryn, maybe if you can take that, since there's a particularly active debate about these issues in Korea right now.
There are two welfare models in Europe, then Nordic, and then Southern Europe. So the supporters of welfare state always talk about successful Scandinavian countries. So many people worry about expected government spending, expected increase in government spending, and try to persuade the government not to increase our welfare spending too drastically. As I said in my opening remark, I think that this momentum or this drive toward welfare state will not last for long. Once we start losing export markets, and once we start seeing the Korean companies that we are very proud of start falling behind Japanese competitors, I think we'll come around and go back to our old export-led growth model.
Well, on that note, I'm getting an insistent placard that it's time for us to end our discussion, so I'm afraid we'll have to cut it off there. But again, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for joining us today, and also for all of you in the audience for listening to us.